The letter had been folded twice and sealed inside an ivory envelope that Renee had been carrying in her coat pocket for 6 days. She had not opened it. She had not meant to carry it at all. She had found it tucked beneath the driver's side wiper blade of her car one morning when she walked out of the building where she worked, and she had meant to leave it at the front desk for whoever it belonged to. She had meant to do that for 6 days. She had not done it. She told herself it was because she did not know who it was for. There was no name on the outside, just the wax seal on the back pressed into deep burgundy, and the faint impression of 2 initials she had not yet allowed herself to examine too closely. She told herself she would deal with it after her shift, after she got the girls ready for school, after she figured out the November rent. She told herself a lot of things in those 6 days. She did not tell herself the truth, which was this. Something about the envelope felt like the last piece of a long and quiet thread she had been pulling on for 3 years without knowing it. She couldn't have explained that. She didn't try. She just kept it in her pocket and went back to work. Have you ever done something you couldn't quite explain and years later found out it was the most important thing you'd ever done? Stay with this one. Because what happened to Renee on the night of the Caldwell Foundation Gala was something neither she nor anyone else in that room was prepared for. Renee Okafor was 34 years old. She had 2 daughters, Imani and Bee, 8 and 6 respectively, both of them bright and loud, and too much for one small apartment in the south end of a city that did not think about Renee very much. She had worked for Caldwell Event Services for 2 years and 9 months, long enough to know every loading dock, every service elevator, every back corridor in every upscale venue in the city. She set up banquet tables. She polished serving pieces that cost more than her monthly take-home. She carried floral arrangements the size of small trees, and she learned to do it without showing on her face that her back hurt, because the people who hired Caldwell did not want to see the people who worked for Caldwell. That was not unkindness, exactly. It was just the shape of things. She earned $17 an hour. She had been promised a raise at her 2-year mark that had not appeared. When she asked about it, her supervisor, a narrow man named Darren, told her the raise structure had been put on hold pending a budget review. That had been 8 months ago. The budget review, as far as Renee could tell, was still happening. It was always happening. She had $312 in her checking account on the night of the gala. The rent was $940. She was not going to make it without the holiday overtime she'd been counting on, and she'd been counting on it for 3 months. She had not told Imani and Bee about any of that. She told them about other things instead. She taught Imani to make rice from scratch on a Tuesday night, and she let Bee help her hang a paper chain across the kitchen window, red and green loops that took them an hour, and she sat with them on the apartment floor after bedtime stories and felt how much room love takes up in a small space, and she was grateful for it. She was not the kind of woman who asked for much. Her mother had raised her to believe that asking was the last option, not the first, and that the surest way through hardship was through it, not around it. Her mother was gone now 4 years since a stroke took her at 61, and Renee still heard her in her head sometimes, that low, settled voice. You know who you are. That's not something anyone can take. The Caldwell Foundation Gala was held every November at the Everard Hotel, a 19th century building downtown with marble floors and a grand staircase and chandeliers the size of small cars. The foundation raised money each year for arts education programs in underfunded schools. It was a good cause, or at least it had been when the late Thomas Caldwell started it 20 years ago. His daughter Margot now ran the foundation and the gala with it, and she ran both the way she ran everything else, which was to say precisely and without warmth. Renee had worked the Caldwell Gala for 2 years running. She knew the load-in schedule, the seating chart protocol, the way Margot's events coordinator, a woman named Paula, liked the centerpiece heights to be uniform within a 1/4 inch. She was good at this work. She was thorough and quiet, and she made no mistakes that anyone saw. This year, 3 nights before the gala, Renee's regular uniform blouse tore at the shoulder seam while she was unloading a truck in the rain. The uniform was supposed to be a standard replacement, but Darren told her the supply order was delayed and she would need to source something appropriate on her own. Appropriate meant black and fitted and free of any visible branding, and it needed to look right next to the catering staff who would be in full formal blacks. Renee went to the Thrift-Store on Braddock Street after her shift. She found a black dress with a structured bodice and a clean hem that sat just below the knee. It was well made, she could tell that much. The seams were straight. It was a little out of style, a silhouette from maybe 10 years ago, but it was dignified and it fit her well, and it cost $11. She pressed it and hung it on the back of her bedroom door and didn't think about it again. She thought about the letter instead. She had set it on her kitchen counter by then. She looked at it while she made coffee the morning of the gala, and she thought again about leaving it at the front desk. She picked it up and turned it over. The wax seal was impressed with the letters MC. She stared at those initials for a long moment, then she put the letter in her coat pocket and went to work. The load-in for the gala started at 11 that morning. Renee was there at 10:45, which was just her way. She signed in at the service desk, got her crew badge, and went to work with the 4 other members of the setup team. 2 of them newer hires who looked to her without saying so, because she had been doing this long enough that her movement through a venue had a settled quality that told you where things were supposed to go. They moved tables for 3 hours. The round tops were heavy, 8-foot diameter with thick bases, and they had to be exact. A precise grid with enough clearance for the catering staff to pass between chairs. Renee had measured clearances at enough of these events to do it in her sleep. She checked each one with the tape measure Paula had left in the service kit, calling adjustments to her teammates in short, specific numbers. 2 inches left. Back 3. Stop. She did not have to raise her voice to be followed. By 6 in the evening, the Everard's Grand Ballroom had been transformed into something that made Renee's breath catch, despite herself. Despite how many times she'd seen rooms like this come together under her own hands. 300 round tables with ivory linens, each pressed within an inch of its life. Floral columns 8 feet tall, white roses and eucalyptus anchored in weighted bases she had helped set at noon. The chandeliers had been lowered and rehung with additional crystal swags, their light refracted across the marble floor in patterns that shifted when you moved. A string quartet was setting up on the low stage at the far end. The auction items were arranged in a velvet-lined alcove off the main room, each one lit from above. It was beautiful. She had helped make it. That was a fact she held without resentment and without pride. Just held it, the way she held most things. Guests began arriving at 7. Renee and the rest of the setup crew were supposed to have cleared out by 6:30, but she had stayed late to fix a table skirting the florist had placed unevenly. A half-inch drop on one corner that nobody else had noticed, but that would catch the light wrong once the chandeliers were at full brightness. She straightened it. She gathered her supplies from the supply cart in the back corridor. She was still moving at 7:15 when the first guests came through the lobby, the sound of heels on marble echoing into the service hallway where she stood. She moved quickly, looping back through the edge of the ballroom to reach the service exit. Head down, supplies under her arm. She should have made it. She was 3 steps from the corridor when a hand landed on her shoulder. The hand belonged to a man she didn't recognize, early 30s, in a crisp white jacket that marked him as part of the front of house staff. Not Caldwell staff, Everard Hotel staff. He looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't quite compute. A slight frown, a scan from head to shoes. "Ma'am," he said, "are you a guest this evening?" Renee said she was staff. She was just leaving. He said the staff entrance was at the east side of the building. She said she knew that. She was on her way. She had just been finishing a last task in the ballroom. He looked at the dress again. She could see him calculating. A thrift-store dress was not a uniform, but it was not a guest gown either. It was something in between, and something in between at the Caldwell Gala was a problem. "I'm going to need to ask you to wait," he said. And then Margot Caldwell was there. Renee had seen Margot up close exactly twice in 2 years. The woman was 52 and carried herself with the particular ease of someone who had never had to think about a lease renewal. She wore a gown the colour of champagne, and her jewellery was understated in the way that very expensive jewellery always is. She was not unkind the way that cruel people are unkind. She was unkind the way that invisible people are invisible. She simply did not see what was not worth seeing. She looked at Renee. She looked at the dress. She looked at the supplies under Renee's arm. "Derek," she said to the young man, "can you please make sure our staff uses the proper entrance? We're about to have the board walk through." "She says she's with Caldwell Event Services," the young man said. Margot looked at Renee with an expression that was not contemptuous exactly. It was more like distracted, like she was already thinking about the next thing, and this was a small obstacle between her and it. "Your team was supposed to be out by 6:30, Margot said. Renee explained about the table skirting. She kept her voice even. She said she was on her way out now. Margot said, "Derek, Please see her out through the east entrance. And she walked away. Derek was not cruel about it. He was almost apologetic. He said her name wrong once and then stopped trying. He walked her across the lobby at a pace that was meant to seem casual but was not, and Renee understood the choreography of it, that you do not make a scene when you move someone through a crowded room, you just move them. She walked beside him without resistance. She held her supplies under one arm, and she kept her back straight. And she looked at the floor once, and then didn't look at it again because her mother had raised her to keep her chin level when the world wanted her to lower it. She counted the things she passed. A couple in formal wear taking photographs near the fountain, a man in his 70s being helped out of an overcoat by an attendant, a woman laughing at something, hand to her throat, diamonds at her wrist. $300 a plate meals waiting in warming carts just beyond the kitchen doors. The foundation's logo printed on the program stacked at the guest check-in table. The same logo that appeared on the letterhead in Darren's office. The same logo that was stamped on the lanyards the setup crew wore. The Caldwell Foundation. Arts education for underfunded schools. A cause built by a man whose letter she was carrying in her pocket. Past the long receiving line. Past the foundation board in their badges. Past the corridor that turned toward the service kitchen where someone was moving plates in the clattering rhythm of a dinner service getting underway. Derek held the service door. It was grey metal, heavy, institutional, the kind of door that belongs behind every beautiful room. She walked through it. The door swung shut behind her with a sound that was small and final. She stood in the alley for a moment. The November air was sharp. She had left her coat at the service station inside. She was not going to cry. She had made that rule a long time ago. You didn't cry in alleys behind hotels. You did not give that much of yourself to people who had not earned it. Her mother had told her that too. Not in those words, but in the shape of how she moved through the world. Upright, quiet, with a refusal to diminish that nobody had ever given her and nobody could take. She leaned against the brick wall and breathed out slowly. A dumpster sat 10 feet away, padlocked. A service light on the upper corner of the building threw a yellow circle onto the asphalt. Somewhere past the far end of the alley she could hear the street, the city going on, taxis and voices and the low, continuous noise of a November evening. She thought about Imani and Bea, asleep on Mrs. Flores' couch by now, their shoes by the door, their backpacks draped over the arm of the couch the way they always left them. She thought about the $312 in her checking account. She thought about the holiday overtime she'd been told to plan around, and the shifts she had already arranged childcare for, and the 9 months of a raise that had not come. She thought about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs for 11 years without once saying it was more than she could carry, who had told Renee with unwavering conviction that the work you do with integrity is yours regardless of what anyone pays you for it, that no one could underpay the worth of a person. They could only refuse to see it, and the refusal was its own poverty. She stood in that cold alley and believed that. She had always believed it. The believing did not make the rent go down. Renee put her hand in her dress pocket out of habit, and her fingers found the envelope. She pulled it out. She stood in the thin light from the alley lamp, and she looked at the seal again. M.C., the ivory envelope. Ivory. The heavy paper, the kind that had weight to it, not like the printer paper at the Caldwell office or the standard envelopes she bought for the girls' school forms. This was the paper of a person who understood that some things deserved to be written carefully. She had known that the first time she picked it up. She thought about what she knew about this building and about the event and about the family whose name was on the foundation, and she let herself think, plainly, what she had been not quite thinking for 6 days. She opened the letter. It was not long. 2 paragraphs on heavy cream paper in a handwritten script that was precise and measured, the handwriting of someone who had been taught to write a long time ago and had kept at it. The opening line was a name, not a full name, a given name only, and it was not Margot. It was Mother. The letter was from Thomas Caldwell, written from what Renee could piece together in the alley light 18 months before he died. It was addressed to Margot, and it said, among other things, that his greatest hope for the foundation was that it remained connected to the people it claimed to serve. That the gala had over the years become a performance of generosity rather than generosity itself. That he worried his daughter had come to see their staff and their recipients and the working people in their orbit as backdrop. He wrote it gently, the way a father writes to a daughter he loves without quite approving of. He wrote that he had been keeping something from her that she deserved to know, a matter he had handled himself for the past several years, that she would understand when she read the rest. There was no rest. It was the first page of a longer letter, and the rest was not here. Renee stood in the alley and understood something. She had found this letter in a parking lot adjacent to the Everard's West entrance 3 weeks before this gala. On a morning she had come in early to oversee a furniture delivery. The letter had been there, maybe it had blown from a car. Maybe someone had dropped it in the lot and the wind had carried it. She had no way of knowing. But it was addressed to Margot, and the initials on the seal were MC. And the words inside were the last thing Thomas had written to his daughter, and she did not have them. Renee could have slid the letter under the service door. She could have left it at the front desk in the morning. She had options that did not involve going back into that building in an $11 thrift store dress after she had just been walked out of it through the east corridor. She stood in the alley and considered those options. The service door was right there. She could have written a note on the back of her crew badge form, tucked it inside the envelope flap, and left the whole thing in the gap. By morning, someone would find it. By morning, the right people would know. By morning, Margot would have a letter her father had been trying to get to her for 18 months, and the woman who brought it would be nameless. A set-up crew member from Caldwell Event Services, somebody who found it in a parking lot. Someone who had been walked through a lobby and out a service door while wearing a dress that cost $11, and who had not thought herself worth going back for. Renee folded the envelope once and held it in her hand and thought about who she was. She went back in. The front entrance this time. She came around the building from the alley end, her supplies still under her arm, and she walked up the steps and through the glass doors and into the lobby the same way the guests were walking in, because there was nothing else to be done. She was not a guest. She had not been invited. She was a woman who had something that belonged to someone inside, and she had decided to give it to her directly, because that was the kind of person she had chosen to be. The lobby was fuller now. A cluster of guests had gathered near the bar cart set up by the front entrance, and a photographer was making his way through the room. Renee moved through the crowd without stopping. She did not look at what people were wearing. She did not look at their jewellery or their shoes or the way they parted for each other in the easy manner of people who expected to be given room. She walked the way her mother had taught her to walk, which was with her back straight and her chin level and no apology in her eyes because she had not done anything that required one. She was carrying something that belonged to someone in that building, and she was going to deliver it. Derek saw her first. His face cycled through several expressions. Renee looked at him and said she needed to speak to Margot. She said it simply, the way you say a fact. Derek said the event was in progress. Renee said, "I know. I built it." He didn't stop her. She didn't wait for him to decide whether to. She found Margot at the edge of the ballroom, near the bar, speaking to two women in bright gowns. Renee waited. She did not hover. She stood at a reasonable distance, and she waited, and when the two women drifted toward the dance floor, she stepped forward. Margot turned and her face went through the same distracted calculus it had gone through an hour ago. She said, "I thought you were leaving." Renee said, "I found something that belongs to you." She held out the envelope. Margot looked at it for a moment without taking it. Then she saw the seal. The colour went out of her face in a way that was sudden and total, like a lamp switched off. She took the envelope with both hands. She looked at the wax seal a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were different. Whatever they had been before, practical, measuring, distracted, they were something else now. Raw and still and a little lost. "Where did you find this?" she said. Renee told her. The parking lot, 3 weeks ago. The wiper blade. She had meant to turn it in sooner. She was sorry it had taken her this long. Margot was not looking at her. She was looking at the letter. Her thumb moved across the seal the way you touch something you thought was gone. "He was trying to get this to me," Margot said very quietly. "He sent it to my car. He didn't mail things. He never mailed things. He hand-delivered. He always hand-delivered. And he was already sick, and he couldn't get up to the apartment, and he must have thought he'd put it on my car, and I'd find it, and I never." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "I've been looking for it. I didn't know I was looking for it. I just knew something was missing." A few people near them had noticed, the way people notice at a party when something real is happening. A small stillness spread. Paula, the events coordinator, appeared at Margot's shoulder with the professional alarm of someone whose job it is to prevent scenes. Margot straightened. She looked at Paula and then she looked at Renee. "What's your name?" she said. Renee told her. "How long have you worked the gala?" 3 years, Renee said, and the spring benefit, and several of the private dinners at the Everard. Something moved across Margot's face. Not embarrassment exactly. Recognition, maybe. The particular recognition of someone who has been looking directly at a thing and not seeing it. "You were walked out of here tonight," Margot said. It was not a question. Renee didn't answer that. "I'm sorry," Margot said. She said it the way people say things they mean, without decoration. She turned to Paula. "Find out who walked this woman out and get me Derek, please." Then she turned back to Renee and said, "Will you come have a glass of water with me? I'd like to talk to you for a minute, if you're willing." The room had gone on around them the entire time. The orchestra was playing. The waitstaff moved through the tables. 300 guests were eating and laughing and bidding on the auction items, and in a corner of the grand ballroom of the Everard Hotel, Margot was holding her dead father's letter in both hands and looking at the woman in the Thrift-Store dress who had carried it for 6 days. Renee said, "Yes." They sat in one of the small rooms off the lobby, the kind of room used for board meetings and private conversations, with dark wood panelling and 2 chairs and a low table. A framed photograph of the Everard's original facade hung on one wall, and the carpet was the deep blue that appeared in every photograph of the hotel going back 50 years. Paula brought water. The noise of the gala came through the wall in a muted, distant way, the sound of a world going on without needing them for a moment. Margot read the rest of the letter. The room was quiet while she did it. Renee looked at her hands and waited. She was good at waiting. She had done it most of her life. She looked at the framed photograph while she waited. The hotel in its original form, 1907 or thereabouts before the East Wing addition. The same entrance stairs, the same stone scrollwork above the door. A different city, a different November, but the same building and presumably the same marble floor where she had been walked out an hour ago. She thought about all the people who had crossed that floor since then. The ones who had helped make it, and the ones who had paid to stand on it, and the ones who would have been made to feel like a problem if they had tried. She thought about her mother cleaning offices for 11 years and the way her mother had kept a small framed photograph on the kitchen windowsill of the two of them at a botanical garden when Renee was 7. Both of them in their good clothes, Renee in white patent shoes. That photograph had survived 4 apartments. It was on Renee's windowsill now. She thought about the fact that the photograph still existed, and her mother did not, and she held that gently, the way you hold things that have no solution. When Margot finished, she set the letter on the table. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My father had been paying the fees for a dozen students in the arts enrichment program out of his personal account for 3 years. Not through the foundation, his own money. He said in here that he'd started it because he met a woman at the gala 6 years ago, a parent volunteer who told him her daughter had been turned away from the program for the registration fee. He was ashamed of that. He started paying the fees and he never told anyone." She paused. "He said he wanted me to take it over, to build it into something real, something the foundation actually administered, so it would continue after he was gone." Another pause. "He sent me this letter, and I never got it." She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. "I thought, when he died, that he had said everything he needed to say to me," Margot said. "We had those last months. We talked. But he knew I wouldn't want to hear this part, and he waited until he couldn't deliver it in person." She pressed the envelope between both palms the way you would press a hand. "He was right that I wouldn't have wanted to hear it. I've spent 3 years making sure I didn't have to look at it. It's easier to manage a foundation than to run one." She said it plainly, without theatre, the way people say things they have known for a long time and have only just decided to let out into a room. Renee said, "I'm glad it found its way." Margot looked at her. "Were you one of those students? The program?" Renee shook her head. "No, I grew up 2 states away. My mother brought us here when I was 16. But you know someone who should have had access to something and didn't." Renee thought about Imani, who drew all over every available surface in their apartment and had filled 3 composition notebooks with pictures she called her comic books. She thought about the sketch pad she'd bought from the dollar section at a craft store, $2.50, and how Imani had treated it like a treasure. "My daughter," she said. She didn't say more than that. She didn't need to. Margot was quiet for a moment. She looked at the envelope in her hands. She looked at Renee. "I have not been running this foundation the way my father hoped," she said. "I think I've known that for a while, and I've been more comfortable not looking at it directly." She set the envelope on the table with a deliberateness that felt like a decision. "I'd like to start correcting that. I'd like to know if you'd be willing to meet with me next week to talk about a few things. Not just your daughter, though we will talk about her, about what this foundation should be doing and about some of the gaps in how we treat the people who do the actual work of making these events happen." Renee was quiet for a beat. She said, "I'd be willing to do that." Margot nodded. She said, "In the meantime, I'd like you to come back into the ballroom as a guest. There's a seat at my table." Renee said, "I'm not dressed for a gala." Margot said, "You're dressed fine." They looked at each other for a moment. Then Renee almost smiled, just at the corner of her mouth, and Margot did smile. And it was the first real thing either of them had done in that building all evening. They walked back in together. Margot paused at the corridor entrance and straightened her gown, a gesture that was entirely habit. She did not look at herself in the small mirror above the side table. She looked at Renee. "Thank you," she said. Not for the letter, or not only for the letter. The word carried something wider than that, and they both understood it without saying so. The room did not stop. Orchestras and auction items and 300 people in fine clothes do not stop for one woman in a thrift store dress walking in from a side corridor beside the foundation's host. The string quartet was midway through something Renee recognized but could not name. The waitstaff moved between the tables with the practiced invisibility that Renee knew from the other side, that particular art of being present and absent at the same time. She had mastered it herself at a dozen events. Tonight she walked past them as a guest and felt the strangeness of that, the way a shift in angle makes a familiar room unfamiliar. A few people noticed. Paula noticed from near the catering station, and her face did something complicated that she resolved quickly into professional neutrality. Derek noticed from across the room, and he had the good grace to look at his shoes. Two women from the foundation board turned from the bar and saw Margot with her hand briefly at Renee's elbow, guiding her through the crowd, and they saw the way Margot's face looked, which was the face of someone carrying something heavy who has just set it down. Renee sat at the table on the far left of the dais, next to an elderly man who turned out to be the foundation's founding board chair, a man named Vincent who had known Thomas for 40 years and who, when Renee told him how she had come to be at the table, sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Thomas always said things found their way. I didn't always believe him." He said it, looking at the room, and Renee thought he probably meant more than the letter. She stayed for 2 hours. She ate a plate she hadn't planned for and hadn't paid for, and she ate everything on it because she was hungry and because she had earned it, though not in the way the gala typically measured earning. She listened to the speeches from the board treasurer and the programs director, and she listened to Margot take the stage near the end of the formal portion and depart slightly from the prepared remarks to say something about her father's wish that the foundation stay close to the people it served, the real ones, the ones doing the work, and that there were changes coming in, how they honoured that, and that she was grateful tonight for a reminder she hadn't known she needed. Nobody in the room knew what she meant. Renee did. She got home at 11:15. Her neighbour Mrs. Flores had the girls asleep on her couch, as she always did on gala nights, the television on low and the girls bundled under the blanket Mrs. Flores kept for them. Bea with her stuffed elephant tucked against her chin, and Imani with her arm thrown over the back of the couch in the particular abandoned way she slept. Renee thanked Mrs. Flores and meant it in the way you mean things when someone has been showing up for you quietly for 3 years and you know it and have never quite found the words. She carried the girls home one at a time, Bea first. Then Imani, heavier, almost too heavy to carry now at 8, her head falling against Renee's shoulder in the loose trust of the deeply asleep. Renee walked the 14 steps between apartments twice in her thrift-store dress and her flat shoes, and she put them in their beds and pulled the covers up and stood in the doorway of their room for a moment. The room was dark, except for the nightlight Bea had insisted on, a small plastic moon plugged into the outlet by the closet. Both girls were breathing slow and even. Imani had her composition notebook on the pillow beside her, as she often did. She fell asleep thinking about drawing the way some people fell asleep thinking about the next day's problems. Renee stood there and thought about what her mother used to say. "You know who you are. That's not something anyone can take." She thought that it was true and that it had cost something to know it, and that the cost was worth it, and that knowing the cost was worth it was different from not having paid it. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket, which she had kept without knowing why, and how it had turned out to be exactly the right thing to keep, delivered at exactly the right moment, to exactly the right room. She thought about the things that found their way when you were willing to carry them. Then she thought about all the thrift store things she had owned in her life. The furniture she'd bought piece by piece from the Braddock Street shop, a chair one month, a lamp the next, each piece chosen for what it was and not what it signalled. The winter coat she'd gotten for $4 the November Imani was born, a good wool coat, full length, that she'd worn for 6 winters before the lining went, the dress she was still wearing. None of those things had diminished her. They were just the texture of what she could afford, and what she could afford had never been the measure of who she was. She had always known that. On the worst nights she had held onto it with both hands, not the knowing that things would get better, she hadn't always known that, but the knowing that getting worse did not unmake her. It was different when someone else knew it too. When someone looked at you directly in a room where the difference between your dress and theirs was $3,000 and saw you plainly and said they were sorry. That was a different thing than knowing it yourself. Renee had not known she was waiting for it until it happened. It was that, more than anything, that she sat within the kitchen after the girls were asleep, a cup of tea going cold beside her hand, the nightlight from their room casting a thin ribbon of yellow under the door. She met with Margot the following Tuesday at the Foundation's office in a brownstone on the north side of downtown. They talked for 2 hours. Margot asked real questions and listened to the answers. She asked about the raise structure at Caldwell Event Services and about how the Gala staff was categorized and compensated, and about what it was like to build an event like the one last weekend without a single acknowledgement from the people who benefited from the work. Renee answered carefully and without bitterness because she did not feel bitter. She felt for the first time in a long time like someone whose knowledge was worth something to the person asking. Margot told her she had spoken to the Caldwell Event Services owner about the outstanding raise and the budget review that had been ongoing for 8 months. She said it as a fact, not as a gift, and Renee appreciated that. A week later, Darren called her into his office and told her the raise had been approved retroactive to her 2-year anniversary. It came to 9 months of back pay at a $3 per hour increase. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough to breathe. What came next took a few months to build. The foundation formalized the student scholarship fund her father had been running from his personal account, named it the Thomas E. Caldwell Access Fund, and opened it to 12 recipients per year across the city's underfunded schools. Renee was asked to serve on the selection committee, a volunteer position, 2 evenings per month, and she said yes, the same way she had said yes to most things she believed in, which was quietly and without ceremony. Imani was enrolled in the spring session of the Junior Visual Arts program at the City Arts Centre, fully covered by the Access Fund. Renee took her to the first session on a Saturday morning in March. Imani walked into the room with her composition notebook and her pencils and her loud, specific opinions about which comic book characters should have been drawn differently, and within 10 minutes she was deep in conversation with an instructor about perspective. Renee stood in the doorway and watched her daughter be entirely, completely herself in a room full of paper and light, and something in her chest settled that had not been still in a long time. If you have ever carried something for someone and not known it, if you have ever kept faith with your own character when the circumstances gave you every reason to let it slip, drop a word in the comments. There are more stories like this one than the world lets on. Renee kept the Thrift-Store dress. She pressed it again and hung it on the back of her bedroom door. Sometimes when she passed it, she thought about the alley and the cold air and the lamplight and the letter in her pocket. She thought about the moment she decided to go back in. It had not felt like a brave decision when she was making it. It had felt like the only available one, given who she was. That was the thing about knowing who you were. It didn't protect you from being treated as less. It just meant you had somewhere solid to stand when it happened, and you could walk back in anyway. And the world had to reckon with that. She walked back in. She is still walking.